So the Major League All-Star Game has been moved out of Georgia, where it's so racist and so oppressive that they, yes, they hand out water in line, or you can bring your own, or any number of things can happen to where you can be hydrated in line.
Well, sure.
And even fed in line. But wow, I hate the fact that there's not a 7-course meal served in line.
Yeah, why not? Why isn't there?
Why? That's the
thing.
And
why limit it to 7 courses? Why isn't it an all-you-can-eat buffet?
That's a really good point. It should be.
Though it should be served by women in bikinis, obviously. And if that's not happening,
obviously,
that's against that's voter suppression. I call it violence because voter suppression is violence. So that's why I call it violence.
That's a good reason to call it violence.
Yeah, because voter suppression is violence.
Right.
So that's violence. I mean,
so stupid.
I'm perplexed at how many dumb things are going on with this story.
Yeah.
And that you have a really dumb set of complaints that aren't true, that are completely hypocritical if true. So it's like, I don't know which part of it to attack.
Right.
It's like their claims about the law are not accurate. If they were accurate, the Major League Baseball would be completely hypocritical. They're continuing to have a team in Atlanta. There's a team that does 81 home games there.
So bad, you should eliminate them from the league.
Yeah. How does CNN continue to operate in Atlanta? Right? How can they? Why don't they have to move? Why don't people boycott CNN? They're headquartered in the state. Why don't they have to move? They're sitting here cheering on others, in many cases, to move. Though, and no one requires them to make a statement on it. Why doesn't CNN management have to come out and say, like, we're going to be leaving the state of Georgia? I mean, it's just incredible. And then, of course, when you compare it to whatever state they go to is going to have laws.
Colorado, for instance. Colorado requires, this is where the All-Star Game will be in Denver. They require voters to present ID while voting.
No.
Accepted forms of ID include a valid Colorado driver's license, valid U.S. passports, and certified copies of a U.S. birth certificate. Voters may also need to return a photocopy of their ID with their ballots if they're voting by mail for the first time. What? What? And then you look at the name of the stadium they're going to play in is Coors Field.
Oh, my gosh.
Well, critics have cited Coors Family Castle Rock Foundation's continuing history of gifts to organizations that actively promote explicitly anti-gay campaigns and candidates.
You're never going to solve this.
You're not. It's just so ridiculous.
One of the reasons why I'm not a boycott fan is this. It's impossible to be consistent on it. You know, I mean, it is. It is.
Where are you going to move it?
No,
that's perfect.
And
where?
Look, the society was designed so that you did not have to approve the actions of people you do business with. That is how. That's one of the brilliant. It's one of the foundational principles of capitalism and free trade. Right? When you go back to the old timey days, everything was done with tribes that always hated each other. Right? And so at some point, there was a thing where they came up with currency. So instead of two tribes meeting with each other and trying to hash that out, they were able to exchange currency for goods, and they didn't have to care if they liked the other people or not. They didn't have to care if they were an evil, warring tribe that believed in some fake god they didn't believe in. And so they were able to actually have commerce and trade goods so that both sides could be better off, a willing exchange, and they didn't have to monitor their thoughts.
Both sides.
Right.
Yeah.
And now we've just reversed this. Yeah. We're just like, oh, you know what? Now we have to care about everything that everyone else says for every company you walk into. And I don't like it on either side. I boycott boycotts. It's the only boycott that I participate in. But I do think that, like, we've seen this now where the media is getting involved with them on the left. They're just like cheering this on as if this is the thing you're supposed to be doing. And CBS wrote an article basically saying, here's the 3 steps you could do to hurt Georgia and their law. We're going to outline the activist steps for you to take to help this battle. Like, what the hell is that? That's not news.
Crazy.
It's not even close to news.
That is nuts.
So I don't think there's any way you can monitor. There's no way Major League Baseball can win. This is why it was such a dumb thing. And in reality, baseball jumped the gun on this in a lot of different ways. Not only was it completely incomprehensible as a decision, if you read the law, there's no way you can come to the conclusion they've come to. You can't. If you read it, you can't come to that conclusion. But they even had an out with like Stacey Abrams coming out and saying, hey, just so you know, we really hate the law too, but it's going to hurt black and brown and Hispanic people and all these other things if you boycott Georgia. So like they even came out, you had the out of saying, look, even Stacey Abrams says we should stay, right? Like it was easy. And they still did this. And now they moved it to another state, which you could argue has, maybe as a whole has more easier access to voting, maybe. I mean, it is, they clearly went to look at what was number 1 or number 2 on the list of easiest access to voting and just picked, we're going back to Coors Field, that field we built in the 1990s. We're going there. That's where the All-Star Game's going to be. But the whole point here is not the general tone of the law. It's impossible to argue that Georgia tightened the law. If you look at general tone, they had to look at individual pieces of it, like the water thing, to try to fake a case about this. Well, if you want to fake a case about Colorado's law, you can do that too. It's easy. I mean, they have sensible laws like requiring ID. And if you're going to act like that's racist, you're going to have a difficult time going anywhere in this country, including, by the way, buying alcohol at your dumb ballparks where you require ID every single time, even though I'm obviously a tad over 21 at this point.
They're also not going to hand you water in lines at the ballpark in Colorado. No. You're not going to be given water in the line. How are you going to go to that game?
That's a great point. That's a great point.
They'll allow you to buy it for $6 or $8 or $10 when you get to the front of the line.
And they're
not going to give it to you in line.
They're not going to let you bring in your own water either.
No, they're not.
No.
How restrictive is that? How are the minorities supposed to live that are going to these games? I don't know.
It's interesting because people don't realize that minorities are incapable of getting their own water. There's this weird idea out there that minorities could, let's say, go buy their water just like white people. And that is not true. It's illegal in most states for minorities to purchase water. And that's why it needs to be given out at the polls. It's the only time they get water all year, Pat.
Wow.
And now that's been taken away.
Wow. That seems bad, doesn't it?
Bad policy. Bad policy.
Also, they moved it from a state that I believe is about 30% black to a state that's 4% black.
That is fantastic. I did not think of that.
Yeah.
From 30% to 4.
To 4.
Huh. Mm-hmm. It's like they're looking for this white utopia to hold this baseball game.
Isn't it? I mean, it just makes so little sense that it's embarrassing for Major League Baseball. It's embarrassing. Don't you have something else to do and worry about?
And yes, they do. Clearly. I mean, they've been spending all of their time trying to change the rules to shorten their product.
Right.
It's like, hey guys, what other place is there where does that happen? Where you go to a restaurant, and they're like, hey, we're working really hard to give you less chicken parmesan because we know you do not want this much, so we are going to give you less. We promise. That's what baseball's been doing for the last 10 years, trying to shorten their games so people will be interested in them. And then you do something like this, which just it's half the beyond the fact that it's just not true, which is vitally more important than the fact that it's going to lose them some fans. It's just false. It's existing on a falsehood. You're manipulating and vilifying a group of people who've done nothing wrong, that have passed this bill, and the people in the state who, many of them disagree with the bill and are still getting punished for it. It makes absolutely no sense. None of it makes sense. But in addition to that, it's also so bizarre. It's like these guys come to you and they're like, well, look, we're just going to say, we're going to take the left-wing position and just hang to it as if it's the fact. And even when you can look at the bill and realize it is not the fact. It is not. The fact is not that it is this racist bill. It has opened up access to Georgia voters clearly from every other election outside a pandemic in the history of the state. And there's absolutely no way to argue that. Now, look, do political parties pass voting laws that specifically will hurt them in major ways. No, I mean, like, look, there are certain clauses in there you could argue, like, especially when they were trying to pass it, things that didn't get in the bill that you could argue were trying to, to slow turnout in certain areas. But I mean, the same thing happens with, Democrats. I mean, what do you think they care about voting access? They don't care at all about voting access. They just want to make it easier for their voters because their voters are fringe voters. They don't show up all the time. They you know what? One of the reasons why your president right now is Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. is because there's a lot of Democratic voters who would not vote if it meant sending in a ballot application and waiting for it to come in the mail and then submitting it. So instead, in several states, they just mass mailed everything out to these voters, and they were able to sit down in their own house or own apartment. The thing came in, and like, I guess I could just check this box. It's prepaid. Just throw it back in the mail. It's easy. I wouldn't have probably normally voted, but I did it that way. Now, look, do we want people to vote? Sure. But like, that's just the Democrats. If they thought that was going to hurt them, they would oppose it.
Oh, absolutely.
As they do.
Absolutely.
In other states.
Yeah.
It's just a false narrative built on top of a false narrative, built on top of some weird positioning to try to look like you're the kinder, gentler company, which doesn't seem to work for anyone. But it just keeps happening over and over again anyway.